Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Working Musicians. I'm your host, Dris Organica. And as promised, today I'm going to be doing a shootout between cheap and expensive microphones. This episode is going to be the first in a series of gear reviews, gear shootouts, commentary, etc. But this is all going to be in regards to studio applications. So, cheap versus expensive mic shootout. Episode 12. I'd like to thank, yet again, Smith & Forge for their apple cider built to refresh, built from fresh apples, 6% alcohol by volume. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I'm on a new diet where it's called the paleo diet. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but basically it's one of those things where if prehistoric man didn't have access to this, these basic ingredients or foods, then you don't eat it. And while it's not altogether terrible, there are a few things I'm going to miss, like beer. Don't get me wrong, I'm still going to have beer, but most of the time I'm just going to have to stick to more paleo-friendly things, such as hard apple cider. So, yeah, don't be surprised when you hear a whole lot of hard ciders helping making this episodes possible, because that's what I drink now. Even though it's kind of like kissing your sister, it's better than not drinking at all. And actually, it's not half bad. It's just different. But I digress. So at any rate, cheap versus expensive mic shootout. So what I did today is I took a little snippet from probably one of the easiest songs I could happen to think of off the top of my head and just kind of figured out how to play it, which wasn't overly challenging. It's actually from a band I used to really, really like when I was a young teenager, maybe 13, 14, called Everclear. I think they're still around, but at any rate, this song just happens to be real easy to play, so I figure, well, hey, since I'm going to be having to play, acoustic guitar and sing vocal lines, 4 times each, I wanted to make sure it was something that was very easy to replicate, not overly challenging, which you will very quickly find out. So what I did here was I took a drum loop, a bass guitar, vocals, and acoustic guitar, and I mic'd them all. So the bass guitar, I just recorded a DI track and then mic'd it. With the drums, I just took a drum loop and then mic'd it over my studio monitors, just like I did with the bass guitar. Now for the vocals and guitar, I just tracked them like a normal person would. A few feet in front of the acoustic guitar and about 8 inches or so, 6 inches in front of the my mouth for vocals. So it should be kind of interesting. So the 4 mics I shot out in this were an Audix i5 as the quote-unquote expensive dynamic microphone. It's just the most expensive one I happen to have, even though it's still relatively cheap. And then the cheap dynamic microphone I used was a fake SM57, which in my much younger youth I got scammed on, although I paid about $60 for what I thought was a brand new SM57 on eBay, only to find out not long after, and I think it'll be for obvious reasons, that it was not a real SM57, and I think the sound clips will kind of lead you to understand why I kind of had my suspicions about it after I first started using it. Let's just say it's not a kind of microphone that's ever made it onto any of my tracks, and you'll see why. Also, so for those were my my expensive and cheap dynamic, and for my expensive condenser, I used the Atlantis Audio 387, and then for my cheap condenser, I used an Audio Technica 3035, I believe, which is I think about a new is like $250, something like that. Of course, I didn't pay that. I bought it used, but you kind of get the idea. $1,600 mic versus a $200 mic. And then for the Audix i5 and fake SM57, about a $100 mic versus what should have been about a $15, $20 mic. although I got scammed and paid 60. Although, man, they sure did a good job of making this thing convincing. It looks just like an SM57, even comes in a nice SM57 box and case and everything. But when you actually were to take two microphones, one a real SM57 and a fake one, the fake one is a lot lighter. The holes for the mic clip area are a little different, and the head of the capsule doesn't pivot indefinitely. If you keep spinning the capsule head around, you'll actually twist and break off the wires. So, oh, and to add insult to injury, just for shits and giggles, I opened the thing up, and somebody was polite enough to do the transformer mod, because instead of having a actual transformer at the bottom of the microphone, it has just a piece of metal that's not really connected to anything, or like it's like a weight, so that the microphone, I guess, doesn't grow wings and fly away. I guess to help make it a little bit more convincing, because otherwise, if without that thing, this thing would be so light, it would just be obvious that this isn't a real SM57. So kudos to the scammers out there, because they fooled me, not for long, but fooled me to buy it. And then, but once I started recording with it, I realized, oh man. But I digress. I think it'll be pretty apparent in the shootout. So what I'm going to do is just go through each microphone part by part, right? And so I'll start with, I believe I start with the acoustic guitar, then do the vocals, then do the bass, then do the drums. And then at the end, I will play a mix of all four of them. And for the sake of keeping it scientific, I tried to keep the levels as close as I could. So what I did with the dynamic microphones is I did my best to keep them as close to the source in roughly the same position as best as I could. And then for all the condenser microphones, I kept all the settings on the preamp the same, only I turned on the 20 decibel pad on it, just to keep the levels pretty close. And surprisingly, that was about the difference, about 20 decibels. So, and then after I'd recorded all the tracks and started to do just a quick little mini mix to get the levels right, I noticed that the acoustic, I'm sorry, I noticed that the vocals were about 5 decibels too loud, and that the drums were about 5 decibels too soft. So in every single one of the microphones, I turned the vocals down by 5 decibels and turned the drums up by 5 decibels, and they all came out pretty close to the same volume. There was a couple of them I had to tweak just to add like maybe another decibel on a couple of the instruments for whatever reason. I guess they weren't quite as close to the source as the other one was, or a little bit further away. So I digress. But the point is, I did my absolute best to keep the levels pretty close. So this thing isn't exactly scientific, but I would say it'll get the job done. Close enough for government work, at least. Okay, and so after I go through each one of the microphones, playing all four independently of the acoustic, vocals, bass, and drums, and then all four of the parts together, at the end I'll have like a little, uh, you know, back to back of the 4 different microphones played in sequence of the final mixes, so to speak. So just so you can have an idea of, um, you know, what the final mixes sound like next to each other. And I think that in this test, it will really do as much justice as possible to try to showcase the difference between more expensive microphones and cheaper ones. Because it's one thing, you may not always notice the big difference when you just hear one track, but when you start to blend them together, and granted, all I have are just 4 mono tracks to make up the mix, I think it's enough to where you can kind of hear the difference and really begin to tell what the difference is between a high quality microphone and a cheaper quality one. So without further ado, here is the Audix i5. Audix i5 on guitar. Audix I5 on vocals.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your street walk case anymore.
Audix I5 on bass. Audix I5 on drums. Audix I5 mix of 4 parts.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your street walk case anymore.
Fake 57 on guitar. Fake 57 on vocals.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your street walk case anymore.
Fake 57 on bass. Fake 57 on drums. Fake 57 mix. AT-3035 guitar. AT-3035 vocals.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't want to be your bad time. I don't want to be your street walk case anymore.
AT-3035 bass. AT-3035 drums. AT-3035 mix.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't want to be your bad time. I don't want to be your street walk case anymore.
Atlantis guitar. Atlantis vocals.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't want to be your bad time. I don't want to be your street walk case anymore.
Atlantis bass. Atlantis drums. Atlantis mix.
I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your streetwalk gaze anymore. I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your streetwalk gaze anymore. I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your streetwalk gaze anymore. I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your streetwalk gaze anymore. I am still dreaming of your ghost, hungry and hollow on the west coast. I don't wanna be your bedtime. I don't wanna be your streetwalk gaze anymore.
All right, so after listening back to this, I guess I can't say I was overly surprised by the differences. But I guess what kind of struck me as odd is even though some of the mics, in my opinion, didn't sound as good as others overall, I could imagine why some people would want to use some of the quote unquote cheaper mics for certain applications. At least if you were to base it on the single track by track basis. But when you put them all together, it becomes very apparent why most people in the professional world do not use one mic for every single source. Even if every single one of the microphones is very good, when you start stacking the same EQ response and tendencies over the same tracks, track by track by track by track, in the same mix, they just don't blend very well on their own without lots of EQ and processing. So I have to say the clear winner in this match was the Atlantis Audio 387. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the other tracks sounded bad. But, well, granted, y'all out there listening weren't there to hear all the performances or the tracks coming directly out of the speakers before being mic'd. Just in case you were wondering, the Atlantis Audio was by far the closest to how the source actually sounded. It really didn't seem to change how it sounded to me. It was almost as close to being in the room with it as possible without actually being in the room, because microphones do not capture audio the same way your ears do. You know, we just do the best we can with the technology we have to try to replicate what we hear in the room and cram it onto ones and zeros in a digital format and over our playback system. And in that case, I say the Atlantis Audio was the clear winner, but that shouldn't be a surprise. Reason being is it's a condenser microphone, and it has a much wider frequency response range than a dynamic microphone does. However, comparing the expensive condenser microphone to the cheaper one, the Audio-Technica 3035, it was even clear there that the Atlantis Audio had a better frequency response range, and I would say a flatter frequency response range. And that's what I think helped make it sound more clear and focused. And additionally, if you were really to start A-Bing them, it's pretty apparent, to at least to my ears, that the Atlantis Audio compared to the AT3035, the transient response was much better, and so was the rear access rejection, as in like the stuff that hits the back of the mic. The Atlantis Audio seemed to reduce the amount of room noise that was coming in, and that's another thing that made it seem in some ways not quite as bright as the AT3035, although I wouldn't call the AT3035 an especially bright microphone. I think it's actually, at the risk of sounding ugly, I don't think it's a bad mic, but it's kind of dull because it seems to have a lot of little extra low-end buildup around, the 250 to 400 range. It seems to 200 to 400 range. It seems like there's a little bit of pronounced proximity effect on it, even though there really shouldn't have been. But it almost seems like there is. And I think it's just a characteristic of the mic. It just tends to be a tad muddy between 2 to 400. Okay, and that's not a big deal. It's not, in fact, it's pretty common, especially in untreated rooms like this one, for there to be frequency buildup. But when you compare one mic to the other, and it's much more apparent in one than in the other, it leads you to believe, okay, it might not be the room so much, and might just be more so the mic. Another thing to consider is it's possible that I had them in just ever so slightly a different position. They are different mics, and they have different shock mounts and attach a little bit differently. But I used a measuring tape to make sure I was the same height and distance, and used the same reference point to try to keep the angle the same. So if I was off, it was probably by no more than a degree, if not less. So I don't think that was really, the mic angle was too much of an issue in this test. So I think it's, when it comes to the high-end condenser versus the low-end condenser, I mean, it's kind of the things you would expect. I don't, at the risk of saying it just sounds better, well, it clearly does, but the reason why it sounds better is because the transients response that it picks up are considerably better, which is generally one of the big differences between high-end pro audio equipment and low-end. It just captures the natural transients of things much better. And also the frequency response was much more natural, a lot flatter, and much more realistic to what I heard in the room. Another thing is the rear access rejection was better. And one thing I do want to point out is the AC turned on while I was using the AT3035. So the kind of that background kind of a sound that you might hear if you really listen closely was actually the outside compressor fan doing its thing. So yeah, one of the pitfalls of having a home-based studio is you have to deal with the outside noises coming in. And that's an example of that. In fact, for whatever reason, it tended to kick on while I was doing the fake 57 and the AT3035. So just keep in mind that if there's a little bit of noise, it's not the microphones uh, making noise. It's just the microphones picking up the noise that was there. Well, it's pretty slight and not that noticeable. If you do feel like there's a little bit of a noise to it, it's not the mics generating it. It's just my AC compressor outside fan blowing and making noise. So that's what that was. I didn't feel like re-recording it because I figured it's not that big of a deal, but I just think it's worth explaining so that it doesn't sound like I'm making it seem as if these microphones have natural noise to them, because they really don't. Uh, so I kind of talked a little bit about some of the differences I noticed between the high-end condenser and low-end condenser. And now when it comes to the quote-unquote high-end Audix i5, which really it's hard for me to say is a high-end microphone, but what are they called? For a dynamic microphone, $100 is, pretty much where you need to be at the very least, or close to it. Anything on up is usually something more specific, like a hypercardioid mic, or is like one of those SM7s or RE20, where it's they're like big, large diaphragm dynamic mics that have better low end response rate and pick up the low end, or like kick drum mics. Those tend to be more expensive. And I guess it's just bigger material that it requires to make them. But when you compare the Audix i5, the expensive one, to the fake SM57, the cheap one, we're comparing roughly $100 mic to what should have been a $20 mic. And when I first started listening to the fake SM57, my ears told me, hey, it really doesn't sound that bad. And on its own merit, it doesn't necessarily sound bad. But when you hear how what I was playing actually sounds, and then hear the way that fake SM57 picked it up and recorded it, it is not even close. And I think it's pretty obvious if you compare what just what the Audix i5 picked up versus the fake SM57, it's pretty clear that this microphone has no low end frequency response to it. Whereas like the Audix i5 really, really tapers off starting around like probably 150, 200, and then much more drastically, after 100 hertz. I think the fake SM57 cuts off, its slope starts hitting pretty drastically around like 500, because it has no warmth whatsoever that you get from that 400 on downrange. So in some ways you can say it's much more focused on the low end because it doesn't have any. There is no low end on this mic. When it's pretty apparent when you listen to the bass guitar. It sounds just like a regular guitar with really big strings on it. There's just no low end on that thing. So I'm not to say that there aren't necessarily applications for it if you're looking for something that really cuts off the low end. But then when you really start to listen to the vocals, you begin to notice, it doesn't seem to capture some of the high end frequencies very well. It seems kind of airy and not very full. Once again, because the low end is just non-existent. But on top of that, it just seems to pick up the high end in a very inconsistent way. It's kind of like it's got notch filtering on several of it. So it picks up the 12K, but doesn't pick up any 5K. Or it was just very strange. And, maybe it might be okay on something like high gain electric guitars. I could maybe seeing it working in that instance. But it'd be kind of hit or miss. Either it does or it doesn't. And to be honest, I would kind of imagine that 90% of the time it will not work at all. It will not even be usable. And especially when you listen to the drum recording, it's so obvious that it just, the high end and the transients aren't there. The kick drum is just wimpy. The snare has no transients. The hi-hats and the cymbals sound weird. It's like you don't really notice the cymbal being hit. You just start to notice that it's decaying. It doesn't seem right. Now, on its own, compared to nothing, it may not necessarily sound bad, but when you compare it to anything else, it's pretty apparent, especially when you play the final mix. And when I say final mix, I'm just talking all four of the parts played together. There's no processing on this, no EQ, no compression, no limiting, nothing. No reverb, just whatever the mic sounds like with recording 4 parts and brought up and level matched. And by level matched, I really didn't even do that. I just did my best to record everything at roughly the same volume. But I repeat, vocals were a little loud and the drums were a little soft, so I turned all the vocals up by about the same amount and all the drums down, or all the vocals down by the same amount and all the drums up by the same amount, give or take like a half a decibel or a decibel. But when you listen to the final mix of the fake SM57, no transients, it also seemed to pick up the room much more so than the Audix i5, which seems counterproductive. Like one of the big reasons I like to use a dynamic microphone is because it doesn't pick up the room. But in this case, I swear the thing almost sounds like it's got a figure 8 pattern or something like that. It's like it picks up as much what comes out of the back of the mic as the front, or at least that's how it sounds. So that's why when I say like, it's pretty apparent, I mean, when you listen to that final mix, it sounds like somebody hit the wimpy button on their preamp. You know, it's like, hey, let's record this microphone on wimpy mode. It just makes everything sound cheap and plastic. And so if that's what you're going for, I feel sorry for you. But no, not to say this mic is completely useless. I mean, there are points where you just need a mic. You know, it actually might be good for like a room mic or a crush mic, you know, when pretty much any mic will do, you know. But like I said, pretty awful microphone. Never really found any uses for it, so I never use it. It just sort of sits there. Occasionally I use it as a door jam, but that's pretty much it. Then when you compare the fake 57 to the Audix i5, I mean, the Audix i5, much better rear axis rejection. You hardly even heard the room at all. Pretty natural frequency response range, which is one reason why I like it. It's a pretty flat EQ spectrum kind of a microphone. The low end was acceptable. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot under 100, but that's kind of to be expected. The high end, you know, didn't compete with a condenser microphone, but that's okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means it doesn't pick up as much high end as a condenser microphone does, which is why people tend to use it, you know, on snare drums, guitar cabs, because you don't need that much of the low end, nor do you need that much of the high end, you know, because other things will be occupying that frequency response, that frequency range. And so that's why they typically are used for snares and guitar cabinets. But I would say it had a fairly open and natural sound. It was a little bit grainier, I guess you could say, than a condenser microphone. Condensers seem to have a little bit more of smooth edges than dynamics, and obviously have a little bit more high end and low end detail. Yet, I think as far as low end detail, the big reason why the Audio-Technica 3035 seemed to have more low end than the Audix i5 was because there seems to be a pronounced boost in the 2 to 400K range on the AT3035 compared to the Audix i5. If you were to EQ them out, I found that actually the low end response range wasn't that much better on that versus the Audix i5. Definitely it had more, don't get me wrong, but if you were to level match them, it really wasn't too different, you know, much past 180K. But obviously it had more high end. But in some ways, I would almost say that the Audix i5 has a more airy sound, kind of like it's a little less dull sounding. It seems a little bit more open. Once again, primarily due to that EQ bump between 2 and 400. But overall, if you can hear outside of that, it seems like the Audix i5, for whatever reason, seems to have just a little bit more life-saving to it. Not that that's necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just a characteristic of the microphone compared to another. So just a few little observations I made from listening through to this. So just I think some good overall feedback as far as expectations of cheaper microphones is they don't handle transients as well. They don't generally have a very flat EQ response. And the rear axis rejection typically isn't as good. Basically, they're just not as accurate of microphones. Not to say that they're not usable, or some of their inaccuracies can't be a good thing to help embellish certain sources. Um, like if I were recording a bass cab, I actually might use the um, AT3035, because kind of that 400 and 3 400 range is typically where I, on a lot of instances, I will kind of um, put the bass as the prominent feature in that EQ range, while the kick drum might occupy more of the 60 to 150 range, right? And that changes from one genre to another, one song to the next. But that might be an example if I'm recording something and I have a pretty good idea of what I want to occupy different EQ ranges. I might actually use that because I think it captured the detail fairly well. Um, I think the high end was acceptable, and that I wouldn't be having to dip out a whole as much high end EQ in certain ranges. But I would say it definitely was not a very good choice for a kick drum. I probably, and by probably, pretty sure I would not use it for a guitar cabinet. I mean, if it's the only thing only condenser I had, and I wanted to blend it with a Audix i5, miking the cone and using the AT3035 as more of like a room mic, it would do fine. I would just have to keep in mind that I'm very likely going to have to cut off some of the low end EQ, which isn't that big of a deal because it's not uncommon for me to cut, especially electric guitars, and just do a high pass filter all the way up to 3 to 400 at times. Usually it's, more like 100, somewhere between 100 to 200. But depending on what I'm using it for, especially if I'm using it for more of a room sound, I'd probably cut it up to 3 to 400 anyways. So not a big deal that it's pronounced because it's going to get cut off anyhow. So not to say it's unusable, but just on its own without having to add extra processing to it, it's probably not the best choice, but it's totally usable. Something else I think the AT3035 might be decent for is for overheads. And I say that because it does pick up some of that low end a little bit more so. Now you'll probably have to EQ it out, but as far as using it as an overhead microphone, it's going to help pick up some of that low end a little bit better than, let's say, a pair of Audix i5s would do. And it's going to sound fairly smooth and not have an overly bright cymbal smash, so to speak. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing just depends on the song. But I think they're very usable for overhead mics or room mics. I think they're are usable for acoustic guitar mics, although not something I would prefer, but definitely very usable. And so, I mean, vocals, I'm sure it would, every mic, it can be hit or miss on a vocalist, but, I'm sure it would sound fairly good for a vocalist. Once again, probably not the best choice for most vocalists, but, it would probably work fine in most applications. The Audix i5, I think, was, like I've mentioned before, probably a pretty good choice for anything loud, anything like a snare drum, maybe as a beater head microphone for like a kick drum to catch the attack of the beater hitting the head. Probably good for that. I think it'd probably be fine for hi-hats if you wanted a slightly trashier sound, less crisp and sizzly sound. Obviously, it'll work just fine on any guitar cabs. It'll work fine on vocals, depending on what you're going for. I think it would work okay as overheads, depending on what your application is. Probably not my first choice. In fact, it'd probably be a very distant choice unless I'm looking for something that is not going to have much bleed, and I'm not looking for very high frequency response overheads, but doable, but not preferred, definitely. I'm sure it would work as a room mic just fine. Not a whole lot of low end, not a whole lot of high end, so not as much to cut off. Maybe not the best choice, but it would work. I think it would mic a bass cabinet fairly well, especially if you blend it with some of the DI signal just to help get some of that extra low end, the stuff around 150 and down to help beef up the brightness of the microphone. But I think based on my experiences, it is a usable mic on a bass cab. An overall usable mic on just about everything. probably not always a brilliant choice, but it's always works. So that's kind of why I like these, $100 um, dynamic microphones like the Audix i5, SM57, our what is it, the Sennheiser E609, the little square one. I mean, they're kind of jack of all trade microphones, master of none. With the exception of maybe snare drums and guitar cabinets, they really do tend to do pretty well on those. I think I mentioned the fake SM57, or that $20 dynamic microphone really has no use for much of anything outside. You just need a microphone for some random application that's not very important. Sure, give her a whirl and just hope that it doesn't mess up your track too bad. And as far as the final one in definitely the most expensive mic of the heap would be the Atlantis 387. Not a whole lot I wouldn't recommend it for, with the exception of drums. Like, I would not recommend it for a snare drum or a toms, just because I think you'd be too likely to hit it with the stick, because this thing is enormous. I mean, it's like beyond huge. So it probably, just because of its size, is not a good choice. And it's probably not what it's just overkill for something like a snare drum. But for overheads, it would do great. For acoustic guitar, super awesome. Vocals, extra, extra awesome. As a guitar cab mic, depending on what you're looking for, probably, I think it would be better suited for blending with a dynamic, more so a room mic or a mic that's maybe a little bit further back, just to help add some depth. On its own, it probably wouldn't see a whole lot of use in my studio for guitar cabinets, but in a pinch it would work, and in certain applications I'm sure it would be just fine at replicating the sound, especially if you're doing very clean guitars or jazz guitars, blues, I shouldn't say blues, more jazz and just clean guitar applications. It would probably do fairly well, especially stuff that, if you're using like the neck pickup and it's very punchy, creamy electric guitar sounds, probably do pretty good on that. For high gain, I probably wouldn't use it in too many applications, but really outside of, percussive instruments where it's likely to get in the way of the stick, I probably wouldn't use it for that. And generally speaking, I probably wouldn't use it for guitar cabinets, primarily, distortion guitars. But I would, in a heartbeat, use this thing on bass and use it as kind of like a mic for a kick drum. Oh, this thing just has a wonderful sound on the low end, just absolutely wonderful. The low end response is just brilliant. It just seems like everything it touches adds a layer of sheen and silk and angel dust. It's kind of like pixie dust is sprinkled down on everything it records. So not too much I wouldn't use this mic for, aside from things where just the size gets in the way, and things where you actually want them to sound gritty and not heavenly. Yeah, probably not where I would use this mic. So if typical applications where you would want to use a dynamic or a ribbon, I would probably not use the Atlantis Audio, just because it's not the sound you're going for, as good as it is. So, all right, I think this has been enough episode for one day. Appreciate you guys for listening, and be on the lookout for more gear reviews and shootouts, and more is on the way. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.